Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today we're continuing the story of James and Diep. While the distance inside this family kept stretching wider, cold words, long silences, pride sitting at the table like a fourth person, Mr. Hwan's health was quietly slipping away in the background. At first it didn't look like anything dramatic, just a dry cough that wouldn't leave. A cough in the morning, a cough in the middle of meals, a cough he tried to hide by turning his head, as if the simple act of being seen as tired would be worse than the tiredness itself. But then the tightness in his chest started. The same steps he'd walked for years suddenly felt heavier, like the house had grown taller overnight. Climbing a few stairs was enough to make him pause, hand on the railing, breath drawn in slowly, stubbornly, until he could stand straight again and pretend nothing had happened. Night was the worst. There were nights when he lay facing the wall, eyes open in the dark, staring at a ceiling he couldn't control. His breathing became rough, shallow, like the air itself had turned thin, like his lungs were aging faster than his pride could admit. And still, the next morning, he woke early, still dressed neatly, still wore that rigid, unbreakable face, as if weakness had never dared to touch him. Eventually, Mr. Hwan made a decision the way he made most decisions, alone. No wife, no son, no warning. He went to the doctor by himself, and when the doctor read the results, Mr. Hwan didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't ask for reassurance. He just froze. Pleural effusion, immediate hospitalization required. For a long moment, he sat there in silence, staring at the paper like it had spoken a language even he couldn't command. Then he nodded once, slowly, and signed the admission forms, his handwriting noticeably slower than usual, like the pen weighed more than it used to. He called Mrs. Huyen only when he was already standing at the hospital entrance. His voice was calm, short, controlled, like always. "I have to go on a business trip for a few days." On the other end of the line, Mrs. Huyen hesitated. "So suddenly? Why didn't you tell me earlier?" There was a pause. Then Mr. Hwan gave the kind of answer that ended conversations instead of continuing them. There's something I need to handle." No explanation, no space for questions. He ended the call, tightened his grip around the phone, picked up his bag and walked inside. The hospital room was white in a way that felt almost cruel. Mr. Hwan lay on the bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling. The heart monitor kept beeping, steady, mechanical, indifferent. Each sound stretched the silence longer, like time itself was marking him. For the first time in his life, he was lying there without a title, without authority, without anyone waiting outside for orders, just an aging man facing sickness and time. And yet, even there, his mind didn't soften. He thought about James. He thought about Diep. And somewhere deep inside him, one resolve stayed exactly the same. When he returned home, no matter the cost, he would still stop that marriage. Illness might weaken his body, but the stubbornness inside him hadn't retreated an inch. At the same time, James and Diep returned home. The house looked normal. Too normal. Quiet. Still. Everything exactly where it had always been. Like nothing had changed. But Diep felt it first. Not because the place felt empty, but because something felt hidden. A faint, unsettling pressure in the air, like the house was holding its breath. Her eyes moved to the living room table. Among scattered papers, a stack of documents had slipped halfway out of a briefcase, slightly crooked like someone had been in a hurry. Diep bent down and gathered them. She only skimmed the first few lines before her expression changed. The patient's name, James's father, medical records. Diep's fingers tightened around the file. Her heartbeat quickened. She didn't speak. She didn't panic out loud. She simply handed the papers to James, quietly, carefully, like the truth might shatter if she moved too fast. James froze. He read slowly, line by line: hospital admission, urgent monitoring, his father, in the hospital, alone. James didn't waste a second. He called his mother. On the other end of the phone, Mrs. Huyen went silent the moment she understood, and when she finally spoke, her voice trembled with something deeper than fear. Regret. She blamed herself for trusting her husband too easily, for not noticing the coughs, for not seeing how exhaustion had been hiding behind his calm, unshakable mask. Within minutes, the three of them were out the door. James, Diep, Mrs. Huyen, rushing toward a truth none of them were ready to face. The hospital hallway was cold and bright, white lights reflecting off faces pulled tight with tension. James walked ahead, moving faster with every step. He asked nurses, asked the on-duty doctors. His voice was sharper than usual, urgency pushing through every word. "Where is he? Which room? Please tell me." Answers came in quick fragments, pointing hands, directions down long corridors. Their footsteps nearly became a run. Time stretched until each second felt heavy and slow, like it didn't want to let them reach the door. Finally, they stopped in front of a room with the door slightly open. A name on the sign: Mr. Hawan. James pushed the door gently and stepped inside. Mr. Hawan lay motionless on the hospital bed. His face was pale, lips dry. Thin tubes crossed his chest, connected to machines humming and beeping with steady rhythm. The man who had once stood at the highest place in the family, strict, unyielding, impossible to move, now looked fragile in a way that made the room feel smaller. Mrs. Huyen froze. Her hands trembled as she gripped the edge of the bed. Tears spilled out before she could stop them. Words failed her completely. James stepped closer, staring at his father's face, and inside James, something cracked. Something he didn't even realize he'd been holding for years. Diep stood behind them, head lowered, eyes resting on that frail figure. Her chest tightened with an ache she couldn't name. In that moment, no one spoke. Only silence. And for the first time, all three of them understood the same truth at the same time. No matter how strong this man once seemed, he couldn't defeat illness. He couldn't defeat time. After a long while, Mr. Hawan stirred. His eyelids trembled, then slowly opened. His gaze was unfocused, still lost in the white ceiling above, as if his mind hadn't fully returned to his body yet. But then his eyes found James beside the bed, and for the briefest moment, his expression softened. The familiar sharpness wasn't there. No guarded anger, no cold warning, just a father. Exhausted, drained, too tired to keep wearing the armor he'd lived in for decades. James leaned closer. He didn't speak. He simply reached out and took his father's hand, slow, firm, like he was trying to pass warmth into a man who had always refused to ask for it. The machines hummed. The monitor beeped. Mr. Hawan's breathing sounded heavy, labored, real. And then, the door opened softly. Diep stepped inside, carefully, as if even the smallest sound might break the fragile stillness. Almost immediately, Mr. Hawan's face changed. The softness faded. Cold returned. He turned his head away, refusing to look at her. His voice was weak, but the severity inside it was familiar. "What are you doing here?" The question dropped into the room like a weight. The air tightened. James's grip on his father's hand tightened too. Mrs. Huyen stood behind them, tears gathered again, but no words came. Only Diep remained still. She didn't step forward. She didn't step back. She accepted the averted gaze like she had expected it, like she knew, deep down, that acceptance was never going to be quick. Diep lowered her eyes briefly, keeping her emotions hidden. Her face stayed calm, steady, in a way that almost looked like strength. No tears fell, even though those words had struck the most tender place inside her. She bowed politely to Mr. Huan, slow, respectful. Then she quietly placed a basket of fruit on the table beside the bed. Every movement was gentle, almost silent, as if she feared even her presence might make him worse. Because Diep understood something some people learn only after years of being judged. Some prejudices are rooted too deeply to be undone by one explanation. Some wounds must be endured, even when you did nothing to deserve them. And in this moment, silence felt like the only way to keep dignity on both sides. But Mrs. Huyen couldn't stay quiet anymore. She turned to her husband, hands trembling between anger and heartbreak. Her voice shook, but she forced the words out. "You're lying here alone. You hid this from your family. And even now you're still judging, still being this stubborn." She inhaled, then continued, lower, heavier. "What has that girl ever done to you?" Mr. Huan didn't answer. He stared at the ceiling like it could rescue him from the truth. But every word from his wife cut quietly into the pride he'd carried his whole life. James stood in the middle of it all, feeling pulled in two directions for the first time in his life, toward his father's harsh shadow and toward the woman he had chosen to walk beside. Diep bowed again, politely. Then she turned toward the door. Slow steps, no argument, no defense, no looking back. In her mind, one thought repeated quietly. Maybe my presence is making it harder for them to breathe. Her hand reached the handle, cold under her fingers. She was ready to open the door and leave a place that had never truly been meant for her. But then, a hoarse voice rose behind her. Not loud, not clear. Broken, like it had been caught in the throat, but strong enough to stop the entire room. "Stay." Diep froze. Her hand remained on the handle, perfectly still. Her heart pounded so hard, she wasn't sure she had heard it right. James turned sharply, shock unmistakable in his eyes. Mr. Huan was still lying there, head angled toward the ceiling. He didn't look at her, but his eyes were squeezed shut, his brows drawn together as if it had taken every ounce of strength to push that single word into the air. His hand clenched lightly into the bedsheet, a quiet sign of the battle happening inside a man who had always controlled everything, and was now discovering there were things he could not control. And in that moment, James understood something he'd never truly considered. Behind his father's rigid rules, the cold demeanor, the unshakable decisions, there might have always been fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of admitting he might have been wrong. And more than anything, fear that time was no longer on his side. Was that single word, stay, only weakness from a man who had just stepped back from the edge? Or was it the first crack in a lifetime of stubbornness? The first moment Mr. Huan was forced to face the truth he'd avoided for years. That rigidity can't replace love. That power can't stop the people you love from walking away. And that some words, if left unspoken too long, might never get another chance. Stay with us for the next episode, because the question now isn't just whether Mr. Huan will survive. It's whether this family will finally find a way back to each other, or if the things they never said will keep tearing them apart.
Khi sức khỏe ông Hoan âm thầm xấu đi, ông giấu kín các triệu chứng và tự mình nhập viện, rồi nói với bà Huyền đó là một chuyến công tác. Về nhà, Diệp cảm thấy có điều gì đó không ổn và phát hiện ra hồ sơ bệnh án của ông Hoan. James, Diệp và bà Huyền vội vã đến bệnh viện và thấy người đàn ông quyền lực một thời giờ xanh xao, yếu ớt và được bao quanh bởi các máy móc. Trong giây lát, ông Hoan dịu dàng hơn khi thấy James nắm tay mình. Cho đến khi Diệp bước vào, ông lại trở nên lạnh lùng và đòi biết lý khi cô đến đây. Diệp giữ thái độ tôn trọng và im lặng, đặt trái cây bên giường ông, trong khi bà Huyền cuối cùng cũng đối mặt với phán xét cứng đầu của ông chồng. Diệp lặng lẽ rời đi và tin rằng sự hiện diện của cô sẽ làm gánh nặng cho họ, cho đến khi ông Hoan giọng khàn đặc run rẩy và thì thầm: "Ở lại", ám chỉ một sự thay đổi đau đớn.